Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
The theme from MASH.
Loretta Swit, one of the stars of the hit CBS series, died today here in New York.
Captain, I know this may sound like a frivolous question, but what the hell are you doing?
The real reason why these actors left MASH.
When MASH premiered in 1972, few could have predicted the profound impact it would have on American television. It wasn't just a sitcom about war, it became a cultural commentary, a masterclass in blending comedy with tragedy, and a safe haven for millions of viewers who saw pieces of themselves in its characters. Set during the Korean War, but airing during the final years of the Vietnam War, MASH gave Americans a space to reflect on conflict, loss, and the absurdity of life in chaos. The show didn't just entertain, it made people think. Its blend of gallows humor, sharp writing, and emotional depth was unprecedented. Audiences were introduced to the quirky doctors and nurses of the 47th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, whose stories stretched across 11 seasons and 256 episodes. But behind the scenes, while fans were falling in love with Hawkeye, Trapper, Radar, and Colonel Blake, the reality was far more complex. Actors wrestled with fame, creative dissatisfaction, and personal ambitions that often clashed with the show's direction. These weren't just character exits. They were crossroads in the lives of real people whose decisions shaped the legacy of MASH forever. One of the most unforgettable moments in MASH history came at the end of Season 3, when viewers were blindsided by the death of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, portrayed by McLean Stevenson. Until that point, the show had maintained a balance between lighthearted humor and emotional gravity, but Blake's off-screen death broke new ground in how television dealt with loss. The scene was quiet, raw, and haunting. Radar walks into the operating room, interrupts surgery, and delivers the devastating news that Blake's plane had been shot down. There were no survivors. What made the moment even more poignant was its authenticity. Only a few cast members knew the ending before shooting, so the reactions captured on film were genuine. The writers wanted to make a statement. This was war, and not everyone got a happy ending. For Stevenson, however, the story was far more personal. McLean had grown frustrated with the direction of the show. Though beloved for his portrayal of the bumbling but kind-hearted Henry Blake, Stevenson saw himself as more than a supporting actor. He wanted to be the lead. And as Alan Alda's character, Hawkeye Pierce, began to dominate the narrative, Stevenson felt increasingly sidelined. He wanted his own spotlight, his own show, and more creative control. So he left MASH at the peak of its popularity, convinced he could replicate its success on his own terms. What followed was a string of unsuccessful ventures, including the McLean Stevenson Show and Hello, Larry, projects that failed to capture audiences in the same way. Years later, Stevenson would admit with some regret that he had taken himself out of the game. His departure marked not just a turning point in the series, but a personal lesson in the fleeting nature of television success. While McLean Stevenson's exit was loud, dramatic, and unforgettable, Wayne Rogers' departure was the exact opposite: quiet, confusing, and controversial. As Trapper John McIntyre, Rogers played the perfect foil to Hawkeye. Their chemistry was electric, mischievous, quick-witted, and always ready to challenge authority. They were the heart of the early seasons, a duo reminiscent of classic buddy comedies. But behind that camaraderie was a growing frustration. Rogers had initially signed on to what he believed would be an ensemble show. However, as Alda took on more creative responsibilities and Hawkeye became the show's moral and emotional center, Rogers began to feel that Trapper was being sidelined, reduced to a sidekick rather than a co-lead. Tensions simmered as the scripts increasingly favored Hawkeye's perspective, and Rogers, who felt creatively stifled, began to pull back. Unlike Stevenson, Rogers didn't get a dramatic send-off. He simply didn't return for Season 4. His character was written out off-screen, with a brief explanation that he had been discharged. Fans were left wondering what had happened. There was no farewell, no closure. Rogers later explained that he never had a signed contract with the show, which made his exit easier from a legal standpoint. Still, the decision wasn't taken lightly. He wanted more than what the show was offering him creatively. Rogers eventually moved on to other roles and found success as an investor and businessman, but he would always be remembered for Trapper John. His departure reflected the growing divide between artistic vision and personal ambition, a common theme in long-running series where the spotlight isn't shared equally. Larry Linville's departure as Major Frank Burns offered another layer to the pattern of actors leaving MASH in search of something more fulfilling. As the show's resident antagonist, Linville played the bumbling, arrogant, and often insufferable foil to Hawkeye and Trapper. His character was intentionally over the top, a caricature of military incompetence, blindly obedient and morally questionable. But as the series matured and moved toward deeper emotional storytelling, Frank Burns remained largely static. Linville, a classically trained actor, began to feel trapped in a role that didn't evolve. He had signed a 5-year contract, and when it ended, he chose not to renew. It wasn't out of bitterness or dissatisfaction with the team. He simply felt the character had nowhere left to go. Staying on meant continuing to play the clownish villain while others explored more nuanced roles. The show respected his decision and introduced a new foil, David Ogden Stiers as Charles Emerson Winchester III, who brought a more complex and sophisticated dynamic to the role of antagonist. Linville's choice highlighted the creative constraints that actors often face in television. Sometimes even success can feel limiting if the role no longer offers growth. Linville continued acting in guest roles and films, but never found another part as iconic as Frank Burns. Still, he remained grateful for the platform MASH gave him, acknowledging in interviews that he left not because he was unhappy, but because he wanted to challenge himself artistically. His exit marked a shift in tone for the show, moving from cartoonish conflict to layered human drama. Another deeply emotional departure came from Gary Burghoff, who played Radar O'Reilly, the innocent, wide-eyed company clerk with an almost supernatural knack for anticipating needs. Radar was one of the few characters who transitioned from the mass H movie to the TV series, and over the years, he became the moral center of the show. Audiences adored him. He was the heartbeat of the E. 4077th, a reminder of purity and youth amid the chaos of war. But behind the lovable character was an actor struggling with fame and personal stress. Burghoff, a private and sensitive man, found the pressures of stardom increasingly difficult to manage. He often felt overwhelmed by the demands of the role and the expectations that came with being such a beloved figure. Additionally, his marriage was suffering. Balancing a demanding filming schedule with family life was becoming impossible. After years of inner conflict, Burghoff decided to step away to focus on his family and mental health. His exit was one of the few that was handled with great care and closure. Radar was given a heartfelt farewell in a 2-part episode that honored the character's importance. Unlike others, Burghoff's decision wasn't rooted in ego or creative differences. It was personal. He returned briefly for the spin-off series after MASH, but it never captured the magic of the original. In hindsight, many fans still view Radar's goodbye as one of the most touching in the series. Burghoff's departure wasn't about ambition or conflict. It was about a man prioritizing his well-being over fame, a decision as brave as any made by the characters in the show. Even as the series neared its legendary finale, cast changes continued to reflect deeper truths about life in the spotlight. Each actor who left MASH took a leap, some driven by ambition, others by exhaustion or hope for reinvention. What made these exits so unique, however, wasn't just the behind-the-scenes tension. It was how the show handled them. MASH didn't ignore these departures or write them off with lazy plot lines. The show used them as emotional anchors, opportunities to reflect on the human cost of war and the bittersweet nature of change. When the final episode aired in 1983, it drew in over 105 million viewers, becoming the most watched television broadcast in history at the time. By then, many original cast members were gone, replaced by new faces who brought their own energy and dynamics. But the heart of MASH remained the same, a commitment to telling stories that were funny, heartbreaking, and above all, human. The actors who left didn't just walk away from a TV show, they walked away from a cultural phenomenon. Some found success elsewhere, others faced regret, but all of them were part of something bigger than themselves. And maybe that's the real lesson of MASH. In the midst of chaos, laughter and loss go hand in hand, and change, no matter how painful, is often the price of growth. On the contrary, the two were reportedly friendly off-set, but naturally, Wayne Rogers began to feel sidelined. Alan Alda's character, Hawkeye, seemed to evolve, to grow more complex with each episode, while Trapper John remained relatively static. What once felt like a two-man act started to shift into a solo spotlight. Wayne watched as his role, once vibrant and essential, shrank into a reactive presence, mostly standing by while Hawkeye took the lead. And this wasn't about ego, it was about storytelling. Wayne often said in interviews that it wasn't personal fame he craved, but meaningful development for his character. Trapper didn't have much to do, he once explained. He was one of two buddies, and then he became the guy who nodded at everything Alan said. While McLean Stevenson had exited with a dramatic farewell and tears from the audience, Wayne chose the opposite approach. Quietly, without making waves, he simply didn't show up for Season 4. The production team was blindsided. They hadn't even realized he was leaving until shooting was set to begin. And here's a fascinating detail. Wayne had never actually signed a formal contract. He had worked the entire time on a handshake deal. So when producers threatened legal action for breach of contract, they quickly realized there was no legal document to enforce. He hadn't broken anything. He had simply walked away from a creative space that no longer felt fulfilling. His abrupt exit forced the writers into a corner. They had to scramble to explain Trapper's absence. In the first episode of Season 4, they hastily wrote in that Trapper had been discharged while Hawkeye was on leave. There was no goodbye scene, no farewell party, and certainly no closure. The fans were stunned. First Henry, now Trapper. The emotional core of the show was being stripped away. In Wayne's place came Mike Farrell as B.J. Honeycutt, a character written to be more emotionally grounded and less chaotic than Trapper. The entire tone of the show shifted. The frat boy. Humor gave way to something more nuanced. The mischief didn't disappear, but it matured. Ironically, in Trapper's absence, MASH grew deeper. Some would even argue better. While many loyal viewers still cherish those early seasons for their brash energy, others feel that the later episodes delivered the show's most profound and human moments. As for Wayne Rogers, he didn't vanish. He went on to appear in a number of TV shows and films, but more importantly, he forged a new path entirely. Educated at Princeton, Wayne had always had a keen mind for finance. He became a respected investment advisor and a regular panelist on Fox News Cashin' In, where he discussed economics and financial trends. He earned millions, not through Hollywood, but through investing. He occasionally popped back into the spotlight for television movies or interviews, often reflecting with humor and grace on his MASH years. And despite the abruptness of his departure, there appeared to be no lingering animosity. Alan Alda once remarked, "Wayne is one of the smartest people I've ever worked with. I missed him a lot when he left." That friendship endured until Wayne's death in 2015 at the age of 82. Alda paid tribute with a tweet that read, "He was smart, funny, curious, and dedicated. We made a pact to give each other a hard time for the rest of our lives, and I'm sorry we won't have the chance." Though Wayne left without a curtain call, fans never forgot Trapper's wit, warmth, and those sly grins. He may have exited quietly, but his impact was anything but small. Then there was Gary Burghoff, the soul of the unit. He played Radar O'Reilly, the boyish clerk with preternatural hearing and a heart too big for war. On screen, Radar was innocence personified. He could hear helicopters before they arrived, loved animals, and clung to his teddy bear like a lifeline. He was the emotional heartbeat of the 4077th. Unlike the rebellious Hawkeye or bumbling Henry Blake, Radar grounded the show in something purer, gentler. But behind the scenes, Gary Burghoff was quietly unraveling. He was the only cast member to reprise his role from the 1970 film, but the Radar of the movie was very different, edgier, even a bit sleazy. On the show, Gary transformed Radar into something magical, and perhaps that transformation took a toll. By the 7th season, the cracks began to show. Gary struggled with anxiety and depression, the relentless schedule, the pressure to maintain perfection, and the isolation from family wore him down. He had a young daughter at home, and missing her formative years left a hole in his heart he never quite filled. In a 2018 interview, co-star Mike Farrell noted, "Gary had emotional problems. He always felt that he wasn't getting the attention or appreciation he deserved, but I think he underestimated how much we all respected him. There were also salary disputes. Gary wanted better pay, more flexibility, and fewer appearances so he could focus on his personal life. The producers tried to accommodate him. They gave him time off, reduced his workload, but it wasn't enough. Emotionally, Gary was done, and so came one of the most gut-wrenching farewells in MASH history. The two-part episode, Goodbye, Radar. In it, Radar returns from leave to find the 4077th in chaos. He does what he always does, tries to fix it. But in the end, he realizes that they no longer need him the way his family back home does. His final scene is devastating. He walks away into the Korean twilight, leaving his teddy bear on Hawkeye's bed. No words are needed, just that image. And for viewers, it felt like we were saying goodbye to our own childhood. After MASH, Gary largely stepped away from acting. He tried a short-lived spin-off, Walter, which didn't take off. Eventually, he devoted himself to painting, wildlife conservation, and even inventing. He held several patents, including for a fishing tackle system. Nature became his refuge. He once said, "I left for 2 reasons, my family and burnout. I wanted to pick up the pieces of my life." And who could blame him? He lives quietly now, rarely seen, rarely interviewed, but still adored by fans who remember that sweet, nervous kid who could hear choppers before anyone else. Then there's Larry Linville, who played Frank Burns, the uptight, rule-obsessed major everyone loved to hate. Frank was the perfect foil to Hawkeye and Trapper. His sycophancy, his affair with Major Houlihan, his deep insecurity, all played for comic gold. But as the show matured, Frank didn't. While other characters deepened, Frank remained stuck. Larry, a classically trained actor with significant range, grew frustrated. By season 5, he made the decision not to renew his contract. "I'd taken the character as far as I could," he said. "It wasn't a fight. It wasn't drama. It was clarity." With his exit, the writers were freed to evolve the show. No more cartoon villains. The humor became subtler, the morality more complex. Larry's departure was a turning point. And though Frank was written out off-screen, promoted to a cushy stateside job, his absence was deeply felt. Larry continued acting in various roles, but none matched the visibility of Frank Burns. And when fans remember the early chaos and slapstick of Mass AH, it's often Frank they think of first. To fill the void left by Frank, the show introduced a very different character, Charles Emerson Winchester III, played masterfully by David Ogden Stiers. If Frank was loud and bumbling, Winchester was cold and calculated. Arrogant, brilliant, private, but not evil. His antagonism came from class, not cruelty. At first, he was detestable, but over time, the layers peeled back. He wasn't heartless, just guarded. He wasn't mean, just proud. David played him with elegance and subtlety. And while many actors left mid-show, David stayed to the very end. His final scene, teaching Chinese POWs to play Mozart, is one of the most moving in TV history. David declined to appear in the spin-off After MASH, saying Winchester's story was complete. Later, he came out publicly as gay, explaining that earlier in his career he had stayed quiet for fear of discrimination. In doing so, he joined a long line of performers who found the courage to live their truth. He passed away in 2018 at 75, but his legacy remains, not just in his roles, but in the dignity with which he lived. And finally, we can't forget the women of Mass H. They often took a back seat in the stories, but their contributions were critical. None more so than Loretta Swit as Major Margaret Hot Lips Houlihan. Initially written as a punchline, Margaret was strict, uptight, and mostly the butt of jokes. But Loretta refused to let her stay there. She gradually transformed Margaret into a fierce, complex, and respected leader. She brought intelligence, vulnerability, and heart to a character the writers had overlooked. By the end of the series, Margaret was not only fully developed, she was one of the show's most compelling characters. Loretta once said, "I wanted her to be a woman of substance." And she was. She stayed for all 11 seasons, one of only 4 actors to appear in both the pilot and the finale. She ensured that in a war zone full of loud men, the women had their voice too, and that voice mattered. What actors did we miss? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the legacy of Mass H, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a video.